now capped at 35%, significantly lower than in the past. Okay, this is revolutionary. Somebody said Obama must have been smoking if he signed off to this, but you know, I heard he quit smoking, so he can't be smoking. Anyways, one of the things that this act does is that it unifies both the estate and gift tax and the GST, even though it doesn't say there's GST together. So that means that $10 million, the first $10 million will be exempt from the estate tax, the gift tax, and the generation skipping tax. Now, many of you will probably ask me, what's this generation skipping tax all about? The answer is that, well, there was a strategy. If you wanted to avoid paying estate taxes every generation, you want to see if you can skip. Instead of going to your children, go to the grandkids. So hopefully you bypass your children's age or level from getting the estate tax. Well, Congress caught on to that many years ago and said, no, this is too good to be true. We want to make sure we're going to get an estate tax at every generational level. So they came up with this thing called the generation skipping tax. So if you're going to skip a generation, we're going to charge you for a tax for skipping a generation. So in a sense, they're going to get it anyway. So there's no benefit to skipping a generation. But one of the things they did was they put an exemption amount. In the old days, it used to be $1 million per person. So, you know, so $2 million max for generation skipping. Well, now, you know, now that the rates are, everything's all unified, I can actually skip a generation up to $10 million. So instead of giving it to my son or daughter, I can just give it to the grandkids, $10 million. And that's a lot of tax to save, because if it's exempt, you're not paying 35% at my level, 35% at my children's level. I've really saved double the taxes. Okay? So that's a very significant savings. I already mentioned $5 million. This is also adjusted. Maximum 35% gift tax. So if you're one of the lucky few who have more than $10 million to give away, the gift tax is now 35% instead of 55%. Okay, GST, that's I just mentioned to you. It's 0 for the year for transfers made between 2009 and this year, before this year. That was for the year where it was repealed, which it's over, so really we don't have to worry about that. Let's see, what's next? Now, here is something extremely new that's never been in place before. It's called portability. Let me kind of explain how this rule works. You know that $5 million that each and every one of us has, that we can save up to $10 million if you're married? Well, in the old days, if many of you have probably heard that if you don't use that exemption when you pass away, it dies with you. It's gone forever. So there's a lot of creative estate planning that has taken place, and what was done to preserve that exemption amount was the creation of what they call an AB trust. Everybody remember the AB trust? Okay? The whole purpose of that was to preserve that exemption. Well, they changed the law. And what this now does, it allows for the exemption amount to be given to the surviving spouse. It's not necessary to have an AB trust anymore. Because in the old days, you get to save that exemption amount. Well, now you're allowed to transfer it to your surviving spouse. And the surviving spouse could use your exemption. So there's now the potential that we don't need having AB trust. This was put in after they found out that a lot of people don't plan during their lifetime. And they end up losing that exemption amount because they didn't do an AB trust while they were alive. Now, this just helps everybody by saying, well, if you don't take the time to plan your estates and get your affairs in order, we're putting the flexibility in. This is called portability. So this is something relatively new. It's radical, and it may take a while for many of us to get used to it because it's a different type of strategy. So does this mean that the end of AB trust? Do we need AB trust anymore? What are your thoughts? What are your opinions? You might still need it, especially if your estate's over $10 million. Don't need it. If you don't have a trust, you don't have to rush and worry. You still may need a trust just to avoid probate, and that's important. Okay. All right. So how does this portability works in a sense? Well, what happens is that if my spouse passes before me, I have a choice to make. The executor has a choice to make. Either use the exemption during that person, for my deceased spouse, or not. And if I decide not to, I make an election to transfer it to me so that I may use it. So there may be some advantages, some planning opportunity for myself that I can use this to great advantage. One of the pitfalls of an AB trust is that by putting the exemption amount, in the old days it used to be $1 million, then $3.5 million, by putting that into the B trust may preserve the exemption amount for, being tax-free assets for my kids. The downside to that strategy is that it was not subject to additional step-up in basis when the last spouse dies. So you kind of freeze the value at the first death for those certain assets. The planning strategy is that instead of using the exemption amount at the first death, allow it in the second death, because that way what happens is that on the second death we can have step up not only the surviving spouse's asset, but we get the step up basis for the deceased spouse share of the assets. And then we'll use the $10 million exemption at the second death. So that means that we'll postpone or eliminate a lot of the capital gains tax that usually occurs when the second spouse dies and the assets of the B trust is distributed to the surviving beneficiaries. So there are definitely some advantages and flexibility in the way that the law is written. So yes, we can shelter it into the B trust, but knowing that the downside is that we're also freezing the basis on it, and that means capital gains in the future. Now, there's some peculiarities with this portability. Even though I may not use the $5 million exemption on the first death, but use it on the second death, there's a tendency, I can't say it's a tendency, people do, after a first spouse passes on, the surviving spouse sometimes do end up remarrying. Now, Congress got ahead of everybody. Everybody's thinking, oh man, I can just keep adding on and inheriting all these $5 million exemptions and have a boatload of exemptions. Well, Congress said, no, we know people, they'll try to do that, but what they did instead was you're only going to get a maximum of $5 million. Okay? So you can't keep marrying and keep adding $5 million on. Some people might say, well, I got a $100 million estate. Well, I'll just keep finding somebody who will croak before me and just keep marrying and take their $5 million. Congress says, no way, it's not going to happen. So those billionaires are not going to be able to marry themselves out of the estate tax. They're going to have to pay. They can't marry it away. All right? So if you guys get ideas like that, forget it. They're ahead of us. So basically this, the rules, it's so complicated, I'll just read it to you. It says the deceased spouse unused exclusion is the lesser of $5 million or the excess of the basic exclusion or the amount with respect to the tentative tax. So in other words, the maximum is $5 million. It says the lesser amount. So you can't inherit more than $5 million. See, what other requirements? Okay.